Hello and welcome to Horror 101. This week we're discussing the film Poltergeist. I'm Paul.
And I'm Dave.
Alright, Dave, so we've gone back to the 80s. We've gone back to a Steven Spielberg classic directed by Tobe Hooper, who I know you don't know who Tobe Hooper is, but for those of you who do, or maybe don't, he directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as well as like a bunch of other horror movies.
Yes, quite the big horror icon within the sphere of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is kind of like a super iconic horror movie. Which, if we do this again next year, you're totally watching Chainsaw.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. I've kind of gone down the list of the streaming services with all their particular films, movies, and TV shows, Halloween and spooky wise, to work on for the next week or two.
Yeah, but you have to watch the original, not like the remake,
Yeah, which is stuck
because
behind a paywall in most cases.
the original's great. The remake is eh. Also, obviously, written and story by and produced by Steven Spielberg, who made a lot of films that were. I'm gonna say this for both of us, but were probably pretty big in our childhood.
Yeah, maybe just the touch.
Yeah, yeah. It has a pretty good cast. We've got Craig T. Nelson here, who, aside from being kind of a shitty person, uh, he had some. He wasn't like a huge star at the time, but like he was known, and we've got some other folks in here: Jo Beth Williams, Heather O'Rourke, who that's a sad story, but we won't get into it.
Yeah, I did the bit of history on that, and yeah, it's a story, all right.
Yeah. Alrighty. So, Dave, what was the story of this movie?
Oh boy. So, in Poltergeist, we descend on a family in a nice housing complex that's just been nicely renovated, nice home living and whatnot, and most seem to be pretty good. So you get the occasional weird little voice deciding to come out of a television. Nothing too much, but enough for the little daughter and the family to hear. And life goes on, the occasional strange, odd thing happening. It always seems to be storming in some sort of case, until all the ghosties decide to come along and say hi to everyone, especially the little daughter who decided to take a trip to where the ghosties were.
Yes.
So, so what can you do aside from call into some people that maybe supposedly know what they're doing? You know, watching a car move over 7 hours.
Yeah, so Carol Ann gets kidnapped. Well, yeah, I guess she kind of gets kidnapped by the ghosts, gets pulled into this like alternate dimension. The parapsychologists come in, and they're kind of like, "Oh shit, this is real." And then by the end of the film, everybody is more or less okay. More or
Yay,
less.
mentally scarred, little bit concerned. A
Yeah,
lot of particular practices that are kind of sort of said, we don't need to worry about it. Maybe you probably should worry about if you're going to take care of getting rid of a graveyard. Make sure there's not a whole bunch of bodies still buried underground with the potential of evil spirits coming up to do a whole bunch of craziness.
yeah. There's some really. I will say this is a film from '82, and there's some really good effects in it that like still I think hold up really well.
No, that's definitely really true. It is a case that it's a case of if you have some understanding of film and the certain effects that you can do, you know how to do it, but especially with the time and when the effects were done, man, it was amazing to see how they managed with certain scenes, certain effects, and it's just amazing to see all play out.
Yeah, and I mean, like, it benefits because, like, 95% of these effects are practical. Like, there's very little that's not, like, physically in camera.
Hmm.
Like, there's the little bit where we see, like, the ghost kind of thing coming out of the TV where it's like, okay, that's done in post, but everything else pretty much is done in camera, practical effects, and they hold up much better than crappy CGI does.
Hmm.
Yes.
Again, there's art to it, but it's sad, but it's also a particular thing that how much of an art that it would supposedly be, and even more so, how much manpower needs to really go into it to really get it to be effective.
Oh, I mean, there's a reason that we don't use practical effects as much anymore because they are more expensive than just doing CGI. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm a sucker for practical effects because I love the way they look.
Mm.
So, what did you think of the film, Dave? Because you've never seen this before. I have. This is going back to it. I've seen this film a number of times, and I love it. But
Okay. Because it's a case of I've always had an understanding of Poltergeist being one of the big traditional horror films, but only either being used as a joke, a clip, or replaying specific scenes from the movie. So going into it, I wasn't completely blind, but it was the one or two scenes that weren't really talked about that completely blindsided me with this particular movie. But I think the case is the one thought when first starting this movie was it kind of gives you a image of the time of the 80s, late 70s, heading into the 90s, of the ridiculous excess of the amount of stuff that's there, of the obsession with TV and technology sort of things when it comes to it, and either a complacency or not exactly really being there that sort of shows the start of the film. That you're sort of like, yeah, this isn't too much of a lie, and it hasn't really gone away. But as it sort of goes on, it sort of has the stage of buildup of first experiencing it and sort of being like, oh, well, this is novel. Look, I could shout, I can watch my child go across the kitchen floor without any wheels. And it's like, oh, how fun. But then the issue starts really arising, and the stress, craziness of it all is just sort of like, ha ha, we have no idea what the heck we're dealing with.
yeah,
And it was just interesting seeing how everything sort of built uh, and went on from there. And I think as well, just sort of how everything sort of permeated. There was the I can't remember too much for the details, but there was a particular character, either a psychic or a ghost expert, that came at the end to help save the daughter out of that world and whatnot, and successfully completing the mission, getting everyone out of there, saying, "This house is fine. Look at the time bar. We still have 20 minutes."
yeah, I think the movie does a really good job of like ratcheting up the tension. Like it gives you that early moment of like something isn't right here, where we see Carol Ann say they're here, which is
Mm-hmm.
very early in the film, and then it slowly kind of builds the creepy stuff happening.
Mm-hmm.
Like it'll give you that creepy moment, but then it'll kind of go back to normality for a little bit, and then something creepier will happen, but then it'll go back to being a bit more normal. And it does this really effectively, that like it slowly builds that tension.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no.
No, it was definitely good with that. And as well as the story sort of building the pieces on with how it going. The father chatting with his boss, sort of saying, "Yeah, thinking about building this new case," panning over to the graveyard and whatnot. It's like, oh well, it's not like we're building over Aboriginal land. It's like, excuse me? Oh yeah, all the stuff down in the valley, it was over Aboriginal land and whatnot. It's like, well, doesn't that affect things?
Yes. Yes, it does. So you mentioned
But I
that.
think the other particular thing within this film was there's not really much physical that you can kind of see ghost wise or otherwise with that. There's the one or two effects, but aside from that, it's the moving objects, the effects that the spirits have on other things that are really part of it. But even with the one or two physical objects that come into the story, man, they came up with some interesting ideas. Because the first and easiest is that bloody clown, because it's the one big thing from Poltergeist. It's like, haha, aside from a television, you can't trust the clown. But the other ghost type monstrosity that's guarding the door when the mother's trying to save the kids is a case of, well, how much did someone have to be on to come up with this monstrosity?
So you mentioned there were a couple of things that you kind of that you didn't know about, but you thought would be iconic from this film. What were they? Because I'm interested. Because I'm
Well,
like, I there's like three or four to me where I'm like, yeah, that one, that one, that one, but I'm not sure what else there would be.
I think the one last big one that caught me off by surprise is when the scientists are coming in and experimenting with what the heck specifically is happening. There is one scientist that steps away, gets something from the kitchen, and has a little bit of an experience. And to kind of recover from that, he goes into the bathroom and starts wiping his face down, trying to calm down. Lights go a little flickery, some water kind of goes a little running. There's a weird skin condition. He just doesn't really like that too much. So much that he just decides to take most of the skin off.
Yeah.
Until you're like, nope, that was just in his head. Thankfully enough. My God. And it was a mild case of, okay, what was this movie rated as? PG at that time? It's like, wait, what other movies came out at that time? And it was like, um again, not to sort of expend for clarity, but a couple big ones that popped up were like Gremlins and a couple other ones, and it's like, okay, no. Yeah, it is kind of the case of there's the one or two moments that if a kid probably doesn't have the mental fortitude for it, they probably could be scarred for life from this.
Yeah, this is also one of the movies that led to PG-13 becoming a thing. So
Probably for apt reason.
prior to like 82 or 83, there was no PG-13 rating, so it went PG to R. There wasn't anything in between.
Mm.
This originally got an R rating, but they were able to appeal that down to a PG. But it was the second Indiana Jones, and maybe Gremlins were all kind of the reason that we got the PG-13 rating.
Understandable in both cases.
Yeah, totally, totally, absolutely. So yeah, I love this movie. I go back to it quite regularly because I think it's just a ton of fun. I think it's one of those horror movies where it's like, yeah, it's scary in parts, but it also feels like the kind of movie that like you could show this to like a 12-year-old and they could enjoy it too.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's
Not
not.
definitely. I wouldn't doubt it would be something to at least kind of introduce to them.
Yeah.
I think it was mostly just be the case of, would it be a case of this would be the first thing you introduce to them, or would this kind of be down the line? Because one of the particular things that I sadly got caught up in with it was before watching this film, I had experience with other Halloweeny sort of stuff that I watch around this time of the year, and there's certain tricks, uh, techniques, and other sorts of things that films more around in the '90s, heading into nowadays, kind of use to affect the viewer watching for the proper experience. And it was a case of at the very end of this film, it was a case of, what are you doing, movie? What are you doing, movie? Are you gonna do something, movie? Until the very end of the credits, and it's like, huh, could this supposedly be a thing?
Yeah, I would. This would be like an early horror movie I would show a kid. Like maybe not the first one. Like I think you would introduce something that's maybe a little easier. Like because there are like those quote unquote horror movies that are made for like 8 or 9 year olds that are like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, they're made for like
Yeah.
you would go to like a Goosebumps before you would go to this.
Mm-hmm.
But I
That
would
would be understandable.
this
And it
would
was be a case of Goosebumps was a TV series that I used to watch when I was a kid, either around that or younger than that age. And it was a case of I could watch that and occasionally get a spook from some of the harder hitting episodes, but Yeah, it was a taste of spookiness
Yeah,
instead of the whole package.
exactly. So, in case you don't know, there are two sequels to Poltergeist. There's Poltergeist 2, The Other Side, and Poltergeist 3. There was also a 2015 remake. We will not be watching any of those.
Duly noted, but it might be a case of I'll keep it in mind and possibly make the mistake in future of watching the remake.
I personally actually haven't seen the remake, although I've heard it's really bad. Um, Poltergeist 2 has an interesting concept but fails in execution.
Hmm, I can
Um,
somewhat see that.
and I remember Poltergeist 3 just being bad.
Mild sadness. I think one last thing before either signing off or moving on from it was the concepts it decides to also bring up with this. Because, again, around in the late 70s, 80s, or whatnot, there was kind of a particular mindset of how certain things were supposedly going to go. And once the science of ghosts and whatnot sort of came into it, it's kind of like, "Ugh, how are they going to touch upon this?" But even then, it was still tasteful and I believe even still understandable for around the time. And it was nice to sort of hear that sort of from there, as well as the sort of thought, I wouldn't be surprised if more built off from this movie into the concept of either uh, the ghost world or the idea of what happens when someone dies and other sort of concepts that probably would have spawned from this because of this movie.
I definitely think that this movie would have like kind of like bringing a lot some of that stuff to like public consciousness. I mean, you had
Mhm.
had some like obviously you had had like ghost movies prior to this, but this was like such a huge financial success and critical success that yeah, I mean, this is going to influence that those kind of concepts later on, of course. Yeah,
Mhm. Mhm.
because I don't know if we've talked about this, but this movie cost like $10.7 million to make and made 121.7 at the box office. Like, it was phenomenally successful.
That's pretty good. But I think it's also kind of a case of how well they did with all the effects that they used and possibly with name recognition.
Oh yeah,
It's probably not too surprising that the film managed so well.
yeah, and it's and I think it comes down to it's a really well made film.
Hmm.
Like, I know, shocking, Toby Hooper and Steven Spielberg made a good movie, but that really does help.
But also the case of people either have if they're not knowledgeable with films and what's like, oh no, just throw money at it, throw money at it, get these super expensive things and it'll work out fine when it turns out to be one hell of a flop.
Yeah, no, I quite like this movie, and I'm glad it seems that you enjoyed it as well.
Indeed, it kind of teetered along those edges of there were the one or two things in the movie that it's kind of, this could resurface a particular thing that I'm terrified of, to a case of I wouldn't be surprised if I'd be able to show this to my nephews in a couple of years.
Yeah, it does a good job of kind of balancing that.
Hmm.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So I think that's going to be it for Poltergeist. So next time we will be doing our final film, which is The Cabin in the Woods.
Yes, because it's a case of I know of this film. It was I was around when it was first being premiered and whatnot, and kind of a case of okay, but with any of its trailers or the information around it, it didn't exactly come off as a kind of horror type of movie to me in any sort of way. It probably was advertised as one, but it was essentially as here's this movie. It's like, okay, anything? But it's kind of like, yeah, from what I see in the trailer, I don't think it's for me.
Yeah, so in case you don't know, it's written by Joss Whedon and Drew Goddard, or Goddard, sorry, directed by
Hmm.
Drew Goddard, who I'm sure you know. Obviously, you know the name Joss Whedon. He did Buffy and Angel and a whole bunch of other stuff.
With how much we've worked through the Buffy series and a lot of other work that he's done before.
Yes, and Drew Goddard was like a writer and that on like Buffy and Angel as well.
Hmm.
The film was actually completed in like, so it was released in 2011, but it was completed in like 2008 and was shelved because MG, I think it's MGM. Is it MGM? I want to say MGM. I think, yeah, MGM was having one of their many uh, going bankrupt things,
Ah,
which they seem to like to do every couple of years. Um, it's not a straight horror movie. It's more of like a horror comedy in the vein of like a Scream.
interesting. Because it
Oh,
was one of the cases of when I first sort of saw it, it had or first saw the trailers and whatnot for it. It had murder mystery aspects to it, but it was kind of a case of, oh man, horror film with this. And it's like, not my interesting thing at the time. Ooh, other shiny thing.
I will say that it does have a far darker ending than you're probably going to expect from a horror comedy.
Okay. So you know where in with the movies that you showed me, the Happy Death Day case of, oh man, Groundhog Day is a Scream movie with happy ending and whatnot. This is kind of taking the comedy horror in the darker direction.
Yeah, it's more apocalyptic.
Duly noted.
Yes, I think you'll quite enjoy it. But until next time, I'm Paul.
And I'm Dave.